Adelaide Dugan laughed the first time she saw Henry Carver walk into the Dusty Creek General Store, and that laugh, bright and sharp and cruel in the way only thoughtless laughter can be, would haunt her for the rest of her days. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat fat and sun-baked along the lower edge of the Llano Estacado, a place where the wind came hard off the plains and the dust never truly settled. Millhaven had a population of roughly 300 souls, not counting the cattle hands who drifted in and out with the seasons, and it had the particular pride of a town that believed itself more civilized than it actually was. There was a church with a bell that worked on most Sundays, a schoolhouse that smelled of chalk and ambition, a saloon called the Red Hen that smelled of neither, and a general store owned by Adelaide Dugan's father, Thomas Dugan, who had built it with his own two hands in 1869, and who had never let anyone forget it. Adelaide was 23 years old and possessed of a beauty that the town of Millhaven had spent considerable time discussing and very little time doing anything useful about. She had dark auburn hair that she pinned up with more efficiency than vanity, green eyes the color of creek water in late summer, and a jawline that suggested she had opinions and intended to keep them. She was not mean-spirited, not truly, but she had grown up behind a counter in her father's store, watching the parade of humanity shuffle through the door, and she had developed the habit of cataloging people quickly and judging them before they had quite finished introducing themselves. It was a habit that made her efficient and occasionally made her unkind, and she had never had serious cause to examine either outcome. She was arranging bolts of calico along the back shelf on the morning Henry Carver walked through the door, and she heard him before she saw him, a distinctive uneven rhythm of boots on the plank floor, one step landing heavier than the other, one arriving just a fraction late, as though one leg was consulting with the other before committing to forward motion. She turned, and there he was. He was tall, perhaps an inch over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor work and not from any particular enthusiasm for eating. He was maybe 30 years old, possibly 32, with dark hair that had been recently and somewhat unsuccessfully cut, and a face that was handsome in a plain, square-jawed way, like something that had been carved with a practical tool rather than an artistic one. His hat was dusty, and his coat was clean, and he held it all with a quietness that Adelaide would not appreciate until much later. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging through each stride with a hitch that made the sound she had heard before she saw him, and something about the sight of it, the ungainliness of it against his otherwise composed bearing, struck her as almost comic in the way that the incongruous sometimes wrongly does. She said nothing. She was not monstrous. But she exchanged a glance with her friend Nora Wells, who was browsing the ribbon drawer nearby, and Nora caught it and smiled, and Adelaide allowed herself a small and private expression that she would have been ashamed of had anyone read it accurately. Later, when Nora lingered at the door of the store and Adelaide was alone with her conscience and the smell of flour and tobacco, she would replay that expression and feel something uncomfortable begin at the base of her stomach, though she did not know yet what it meant. Henry Carver walked to the counter and placed both hands on the edge of it and looked at her directly. His eyes were gray, she noticed, and they were steady in a way that made her feel she was being measured with some instrument she did not fully understand. "Good morning," he said. His voice was unhurried, low, and clearly accustomed to open spaces. "I was told this is the place to purchase provisions for a homestead claim. I have a list if you have time for it." "I have time," Adelaide said, and her voice came out professionally, which was the one thing she was always able to manage. He slid the list across the counter. It was written in a careful, educated hand: flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, lard, nails, a leather hinge, lamp oil. The handwriting surprised her in some way she could not articulate. "You are new to Millhaven," she said. It was not a question. "Arrived 2 days ago," he said. I filed a claim on the Crescent land, about 8 miles north of town. The Crescent land, Adelaide looked up from the list. That parcel has been standing empty for 4 years. The soil is decent enough on the eastern half, but the western portion is full of caliche not 3 inches down. He regarded her with something that might have been respect or might have been patience. I appreciate that. I walked the whole of it before I filed. You walked 8 miles of rough country with she stopped. She had almost said it. The words had arrived in her mouth with the casual cruelty of habit, and she had stopped them just in time, but she felt the heat rising in her face, and she looked down at the list again. I only meant to say the terrain is uneven. It is, he agreed, and if he had heard what she had almost said, he gave no indication of it. But I have managed uneven terrain before. She filled his order with brisk competence, calculating the total in her head and writing it neatly in the ledger. He paid cash, which was not always the case with new homesteaders, and he thanked her and carried his goods out in 2 trips without asking for help, navigating the steps of the porch with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything else. She watched him from behind the curtain in the doorway between the store and the back room, and she told herself she was only watching to see if he managed all right, which was a lie she told well enough that she almost believed it. His name spread through Millhaven the way all newcomers' names did, carried on the current of gossip from the barber shop to the church steps to the Red Hen and back again. Henry Carver, former Army. Came from somewhere east, possibly Kansas, possibly Missouri, no one was entirely certain. Had a limp from some old injury that the Army surgeon had not fully fixed. Quiet, paid his debts, did not drink to excess. These were the facts as Millhaven assembled them, and they were considered sufficient. Adelaide heard the former Army part and noted it and set it aside. She was not yet in a position to understand what it meant. She saw him again 3 weeks later, at the Methodist church on a Sunday morning when the sermon was running long and the congregation was thinking about dinner. He sat 2 rows ahead of her and to the left, hat held in both hands in his lap, and she could see the back of his neck, and the way he sat very still for the duration of the service, not fidgeting the way most people did when Reverend Marsh began circling back to points he had already made. Afterward in the yard, she watched him speak to old Claude Hartley, who ranched the land adjacent to the Crescent parcel. They spoke for a long time, Claude doing most of the talking with the enthusiasm of a man who had found a willing audience, and Henry Carver nodding at intervals and asking questions that Adelaide was too far away to hear. She walked over because it was a social occasion and she knew Claude and it was perfectly natural. Nothing else. "Miss Dugan," Claude said, brightening at her approach. "Do you know Mr. Carver here? He has taken the Crescent claim." "We have met at the store," she said. She looked at Henry Carver and he looked at her, and something passed between them that she could not name, a current of recognition that was not quite comfort. "Your father runs a good store," Henry said. "I found everything I needed." "My father will be glad to hear it." A pause, during which she became aware of the inadequacy of what she had just said. "Are you settling in well?" "The roof needs work," he said. "But it is standing. That is a beginning." "It is," she agreed. They stood in the pleasant mid-morning sun, and Claude talked about the spring rains and the grass, and Adelaide found herself occasionally watching Henry Carver's profile while he listened to Claude, and once he turned and caught her looking, and neither of them looked away for 1 beat longer than was strictly appropriate. And then they both looked away at the same moment, with the particular synchronized awkwardness of 2 people who have been caught at something neither is ready to name. She told Nora about it that afternoon, sitting on the back steps of the Dugan house with their shoes off and the warm air settling around them. "He is very quiet," Adelaide said. "Quiet can mean all manner of things," Nora said. "It can mean he has nothing to say. It can also mean he has a great deal to say and is choosing carefully," Nora said, which was more philosophical than Adelaide had expected from Nora. "He has a very steady sort of presence," Adelaide said, and then stopped because she was not sure she wanted to examine why she had chosen that word. "He is not bad looking," Nora offered. "I did not say that." You did not have to." Nora ate a piece of cornbread. "The limp does not diminish him." Adelaide was quiet. She was thinking about the moment in the store 3 weeks ago, about the words that had risen to her mouth, and about the fact that he had walked out carrying his own goods without complaint or self-consciousness, and something about that memory had been sitting at an awkward angle in her chest ever since. "No," she said finally. "It does not." The weeks moved forward the way weeks do in a small town, with the slow accumulation of ordinary events and the occasional punctuation of something unusual. Henry Carver came to the store twice more in April, each time with a list, each time paying in cash, each time conducting his business with the same unhurried competence. The first time, he purchased a set of window hinges and a coil of rope and some calico, and Adelaide noted the calico because it suggested he was making something for the interior of the house, and she could not help imagining what the interior of the house looked like, whether he had curtains, and whether he had any idea how to hang them. The second time, he purchased seed corn and some additional provisions, and he lingered at the counter for a moment after she had totaled his bill, turning his hat in his hands. "You mentioned the eastern portion of the Crescent land," he said, "that it was the more workable ground." "That is what I have heard from people who have farmed nearby," she said. "I wanted you to know you were right," he said. "I put in a test row and it is coming up well." A small pause. "I appreciate practical information more than polite conversation, so I thought you would want to know." She felt something move in her that was almost laughter, but warm, not sharp. "I am glad the information was useful." He nodded and picked up his goods and left, and she stood there for a moment with her hands still on the counter, thinking that nobody had ever thanked her for practical information before, because nobody had ever taken it seriously enough to test it and come back with results. May came in with thunderstorms that rolled off the plains and turned the streets of Millhaven into small rivers for 3 days running, and the store was busy with people who needed to replace things that had been ruined by leaks and those who simply wanted somewhere dry to stand. On the second day of rain, Henry Carver came in soaking wet and asked for canvas sheeting, because the roof of the Crescent house had finally given up its last argument against gravity. Adelaide sold him the canvas sheeting and then, without entirely planning it, said that her father knew of a man in town who did good roof work at a fair price. "I can manage it myself," Henry said. "In this rain." He looked at her steadily. "The rain will stop." "It will," she agreed, "but your belongings will be ruined by then." He considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. "What is the man's name?" She wrote it on a scrap of paper. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at her for a moment. "Do you always give away the names of your competitors?" he asked, and there was something in it that was almost, very nearly, a tease. "My father's store does not do roof work," she said. "So he is not a competitor." "No," Henry agreed, "I suppose not." And there was a thing in his eyes then that was not quite a smile, but that resided in the same neighborhood. And Adelaide felt warmth bloom in her face and turned to adjust something on a nearby shelf. She thought about him that night while the rain fell on the roof above her, and she lay in her bed listening to it. Thought about the steadiness of him, the way he moved through the world without apology or performance. And she thought about what had happened in the first few minutes of the first day she had ever seen him, and the way that moment kept coming back to her with a discomfort that was growing rather than diminishing, which told her something she was not yet prepared to admit. The social calendar of Millhaven moved at its own unhurried pace, and in late May there was a church social that served the dual purpose of raising money for the schoolhouse roof and giving the residents of Millhaven an excuse to stand near each other and discuss their neighbors. Adelaide wore her best dress, which was a green that matched the creek water, and she arrived with her father, who immediately disappeared into a conversation about cattle prices with 3 other men, which was what Thomas Dugan did at all social occasions. Henry Carver arrived late, and his coat was clean and his boots were polished, and he stood on the periphery of things for a few minutes with a plate of food and a glass of sweet tea, and looked like a man who was deciding whether to engage with the world or remain pleasantly outside of it. Adelaide watched him from across the yard and then walked toward him, because she had by this point admitted to herself that she wanted to speak with him more than she wanted to stand where she was. The roof held, she said, nodding at the sky, which had been clear for 2 weeks. It held, he said. Your man Avery does good work. He does. His father built most of the original town. Henry looked around at the assembly of Millhaven with an expression of genuine interest. It is a good town, he said. People are direct. People are nosy, Adelaide said. We dress it up as directness. He looked at her sharply, and then the thing happened again, the thing that was almost a smile, and this time it broke through far enough that she could see it was a real one, a very good one, quiet and genuine, and reaching his gray eyes and transforming his face briefly into something that was not just handsome in a practical way, but handsome in a way that made her breath catch somewhere in the middle of her chest. I appreciate that, he said. The honesty about the nosiness. You will find everyone here knows your business before you do, she said. I have already found that. What have they told you about me? She asked, and the question surprised her even as she asked it because she had not planned to. He was quiet for a moment, looking across the yard. That you are the best person in town to ask if you need to know what something actually costs, what the land is actually like, and whether a thing is actually worth doing. She felt something tender and uncomfortable at the same time, like a bruise being touched gently. That is a careful answer. I gave you what I thought was useful, he said, and glanced at her sideways, and she remembered that she had said something very like that to him in the store. They stood together for the remainder of the social and talked about the land and the weather and the town and various small things, and it was easy in a way that surprised her, because she was not always easy to talk to and she knew it. And yet with him, the conversation moved without strain, finding its own current and following it naturally. Her father appeared at her elbow at one point and introduced himself to Henry, and the two men spoke for 10 minutes about soil management and water rights with the focused pleasure of people who share a practical interest. And Adelaide watched her father's face and saw him decide something favorable, which was not something Thomas Dugan did quickly about anyone. Walking home that evening, her father said nothing directly, which was also his way. He said it had been a good social. He said the sweet tea had been too sweet. He said he thought the Crescent parcel had more potential than people gave it credit for. Then he said nothing else, and Adelaide walked beside him through the warm May night and understood all of it. June arrived and things began to shift, the way they do when two people are moving toward each other without having yet decided to. Henry came into the store, and his visits were no longer purely transactional, or rather they were transactional but also something else, a few additional minutes of conversation that neither of them seemed inclined to conclude. He told her about the progress on the land, the test crops that were coming up, the fence lines he was repairing, the well he had hired a man to help him deepen. She told him about the town, its history and its characters, and the particular hierarchies that governed it beneath the surface of politeness, and she told him these things with a candor that she could tell he valued, because he listened to them the way he listened to everything she said, as though it was information worth attending to. She learned small things about him across those weeks, that he drank his coffee black and strong, that he had been a reader since boyhood and had packed 3 books in his saddlebags when he came to Texas, which she thought was extraordinary and slightly reckless, that he had been born in Missouri, in a town east of Kansas City, and had gone to school until the age of 16, when his family's circumstances had changed in the way that the circumstances of ordinary families were always changing in those years, that he had joined the Army at 18, that he did not talk about the Army beyond those simple facts, and she did not push, because his face closed slightly when it came up in the way that some doors close, not slammed but firmly, and she understood that there were rooms in Henry Carver that required invitation, What she did not know yet was what those rooms contained. What she did not know yet was the answer to the question of the limp, and she had not asked because she was ashamed of the question, and of what had been in her face the first time she had seen it, and the shame was growing in her, and it was changing her in ways she was only beginning to understand. There were moments of pure pleasure in those weeks, moments she would return to later and press like flowers between pages. The afternoon he came in with a question about the proper storage of seed corn, and they argued pleasantly about it for 20 minutes, she drawing on what she had heard from every farmer in the county, and he drawing on what he had read and what he had tested himself, and neither of them being entirely right and neither being entirely wrong, and both of them enjoying it thoroughly. The morning there was a thunderstorm, and he arrived in the store with water running off the brim of his hat, and she laughed at the sight, and he shook the water off his hat brim onto the floor in a gesture of mock formality that made her laugh harder, and he stood there watching her laugh with an expression on his face that she did not examine closely until later, because if she had examined it then she would have known, and she was not sure she was ready. The evening at the end of June when her father asked him to stay for supper and he stayed, and they sat at the kitchen table while the light turned gold through the windows and talked until it was dark, her father telling stories about the early years of the town and Henry listening with genuine interest, and occasionally asking the kind of precise question that makes the teller of the story feel that it is worth telling. After he left, Thomas Dugan sat at the table for a moment with his coffee cup and said, "That is a good man, Adelaide," which from Thomas Dugan was as conclusive as any speech. Adelaide said nothing. She was already thinking about something Henry had said during supper, a small thing, hardly anything, a comment about how the light in the evening changed the look of the land and made it seem like something worth fighting for, and she had heard the word fighting and looked at his face and seen something there beneath the surface of it, some large and serious thing, and she had not asked about it. She had not asked, and it had stayed with her all through the evening, and it was staying with her now. July in Millhaven was hot in a way that pressed down on everything and made tempers run short, and the sky turn white at noon. It was in this heat, on an afternoon in mid-July, that everything changed, and the change began with cruelty and ended somewhere Adelaide had not known she could reach. She had been standing in the store with Nora and two other women from town, Cecilia March and Martha Boone, who were the kind of women who sharpened their humor against other people's shortcomings. They were all buying fabric for a joint sewing project, and they were gossiping in the pleasant, meaningless way of a slow afternoon. Henry Carver was the subject, as he had been the subject of most conversations in Millhaven for the past month, and Cecilia was describing how she had seen him at the blacksmith's that morning trying to manage some piece of equipment. "He struggles so with that leg," Cecilia said, with a sympathy that was not quite sympathy. "It must be awfully difficult," Martha said. Adelaide should have said something in his defense then. She had the words ready, the proper words, the fair words, and she knew they were ready because she had thought about Henry's limp and his bearing and his dignity a great deal in the past months, and she understood it very differently than she had in the first minutes of the first day. But the afternoon was hot and Cecilia was watching her, and there was some old reflex in her, some remnant of the woman she had been before Henry Carver had walked in and recalibrated her understanding of what a person could be, and instead of the right words she said the wrong ones. "He does look rather like a wounded rooster coming down the street," she said. The words landed. Nora's face changed. Cecilia laughed. Martha laughed. Adelaide felt the words she had just spoken sitting outside herself, separate and terrible, and she understood immediately and completely that she had done something she could not take back. What made it worse, catastrophically worse, was the man who appeared in the doorway at that exact moment, who had been approaching the store from the street and whose hand was already on the door frame, and who therefore heard the words clearly, all of them, in Adelaide Dugan's own voice, with Cecilia's and Martha's laughter rising behind them like smoke. It was Henry Carver. He stood in the doorway for one moment, and his face did something she would never forget. A flash of something raw and old and deeply hurt, passing across those steady gray eyes like a cloud across the sun, there and gone, and replaced by the composure she had come to associate with him. Though she now understood that composure was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, which was a very different thing, and that management was costing him something right now. He looked at her. She looked at him. The world narrowed to the space between them. "I need window glass," he said, and his voice was exactly as it always was, unhurried and low. "2 panes, 8 by 10. Adelaide came out from behind the counter and found the glass and wrapped it and told him the price, and he paid, and she handed him his change, and every single exchange of those simple necessary words was like touching a hot iron. She wanted to speak. She was sick with the need to speak, to say something that would undo what had just been done. But there were no words in any language that would do it, and she knew that. And so she said nothing, which was the worst possible answer. He nodded once, picked up the wrapped glass and walked out. She stood at the counter and listened to his uneven steps cross the porch and go down the stairs and move away along the street. That distinctive, unhurried rhythm that she had in the past weeks come to associate with something she was only willing to call admiration. And she stood there until the sound of it was gone, and the store was quiet except for Cecilia saying something she did not hear. And then she excused herself and went into the back room and stood in the cool dark among the stored goods and pressed her hands over her face. She did not cry. She felt she did not deserve to. She left early that day and walked home through the July heat and told her father she had a headache, which was not untrue, and went to her room. She lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling and replayed the scene in the doorway over and over, the expression on his face, the way he had composed himself, the particular dignity with which he had conducted a mundane transaction after hearing himself mocked, and she felt something she could only describe as anguish, slow and growing. She did not sleep well. The following morning she went to Reverend Marsh, not because she was particularly devout, but because she needed someone who was constitutionally required to hear confession without repeating it. "I did something I am ashamed of," she told him, sitting in the small front room of the parsonage. Reverend Marsh was a sensible man who had been in Millhaven for 15 years and had very little remaining capacity for surprise. "Tell me," he said. She told him, all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she valued. "And now," he said when she had finished, "I want to apologize," she said. "I need to apologize, but I am afraid he will not want to hear it." "That is possible," Reverend Marsh said, "but the apology is necessary for his sake, not only yours." She thought about this. "He should not have to hear me explain myself." "No. Perhaps what he needs to hear is simply that you are sorry and that the thing you said was wrong." She went home and she sat at the kitchen table, and she wrote the apology, and she crossed it out and wrote it again and crossed it out again. And after 3 attempts, she folded the best version and put it in her apron pocket and went out into the morning. She drove herself in the small wagon north of town, 8 miles along the road that wound through the grassland, and she pulled up in front of the Crescent house, which was not much of a house yet, but was clearly in the process of becoming one, with fresh boards on the west wall and new window frames and a repaired roof. Henry Carver was in the yard splitting wood, and he heard the wagon and turned and saw her and went very still. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward him and stopped at a respectful distance. "I came to apologize," she said, "for what I said yesterday. It was unkind and it was wrong and you did not deserve it." He said nothing for a long moment. He set the axe down against the stump and straightened and looked at her, and the gray eyes were unreadable in a way they had never been before, at least not to her, because in all their weeks of conversation she had learned to read him a little, and now the door was closed. "I have heard worse," he said. "That does not make it acceptable. I said something cruel and I am sorry. She stopped. She had been about to say she was thoughtless, but that was only partially true, and she had promised herself she would be honest. "I was afraid," she said. "I do not know entirely of what, but I was reverting to something small in myself, and you heard it, and I am sorry." The silence stretched. A mockingbird was making its varied noise somewhere in the scrubby trees near the fence line, and the wind moved through the grass. "I accept your apology," he said, not warmly, not coldly, simply. "Thank you." She stood for another moment, not sure whether to go or stay, and made the decision to go because she had done what she came to do, and anything beyond it would be for her own comfort, not his. She turned and walked back to the wagon. "Miss Dugan," he said. She turned. He looked at her across the yard, and his expression was still closed, but there was something moving in it, something working its way toward the surface. "I appreciate that you came out here to say it in person," he said. "You could have sent a note." "I could have," she agreed. "But that seemed like the coward's way." He nodded. Something in his face shifted very slightly, the closed door not opening but the light under it changing. "I will see you in town," he said. "Yes," she said, "you will." She drove back to Millhaven, and she did not feel relieved exactly, because the apology had not erased what she had done. But she felt that she had moved in the right direction, which was different from feeling good and was perhaps more honest. July moved toward August, and Henry came back to the store in the following week, and things were more careful between them. Not cold, but careful, like people walking on ground that might be unsteady, testing each step. He was polite and she was polite, and they were both reaching for the ease they had built before the doorway moment and not quite finding it, and she thought perhaps they never would, and this thought was dimmer inside her than she expected, which told her something. It was Nora who changed things, in the way that Nora sometimes did things, with cheerful disregard for social consequence. She came to Adelaide on a Saturday afternoon in early August with the expression of a woman who has information and intends to deploy it. "I spoke to Claude Hartley this morning," Nora said, settling into the chair in the back of the store with the comfort of someone who intends to stay. "About Henry Carver." "Nora, no. Listen." Nora leaned forward. "Claude was in the same regiment. Did you know that?" Adelaide had not known that. "The 10th Cavalry," Nora said. "Do you know what that is?" Adelaide knew, in the distant way of someone who reads the newspaper and pays attention to the world. The 10th Cavalry was one of the Buffalo Soldier regiments, the United States Army cavalry units composed largely of colored soldiers that had been formed after the war and that had served on the frontier since. They had a substantial reputation for courage and competence, though the newspapers did not always give them the credit they earned. "Claude Hartley is white," she said slowly. "He was an officer," Nora said. "Captain Hartley, in 1874, the Red River War." "Do you know what happened in the Red River War?" Adelaide did know. Every person in Texas who followed such things knew. It had been the campaign that had broken the last organized resistance of the Comanche and the Kiowa on the southern plains, that had finally, irrevocably, brought the open range under the control of the United States Army and ended the era of the great buffalo herds and the great raiding culture, the campaign that had been brutal and complicated, and that she had never known quite how to think about. "Claude told me about Henry," Nora said. Her voice had lost its usual brightness and was something quieter. "About what happened?" Adelaide sat down. Nora told her. In the autumn of 1874, during a cavalry engagement in the Palo Duro Canyon, Henry Carver, then 26 and a sergeant, had been riding with a scouting party ahead of the main column. The party had come under fire from a Comanche position on the canyon rim. In the confusion of the engagement, a young lieutenant, barely 20 years old and just arrived from the east, had been knocked from his horse and left in the open. Henry had ridden back for him under active fire, pulled him up, and taken a rifle round through his left thigh in the process. The bone had been shattered, and the army surgeon had done what he could with what he had, which in 1874 in the field was not very much. Henry had survived. The leg had not been taken, which was itself considered extraordinary, but it had healed imperfectly, as shattered bones often did, and the limp was the result, the permanent and daily visible result of the choice he had made to ride back into fire for a boy he barely knew. The lieutenant had survived. He was now a captain stationed in Kansas, Nora reported, and he had written to Claude Hartley afterward to say that he owed Henry Carver his life and that this was a debt that could not be repaid. Adelaide sat very still in the back of the store while Nora finished talking. She thought about the Limp. She thought about every step she had ever watched him take, every deliberate stride, every time he had carried his own goods without complaint, every time he had walked 8 miles of rough country to understand the land he intended to work, every morning and every evening and every ordinary moment of his life conducted on a leg that would never be whole because he had turned his horse around and gone back. She thought about what she had said. She thought about his face in the doorway. And then she went home and she went to her room and she sat on the edge of her bed and she wept. She wept the way she had not wept since her mother had died, fully and without reservation, a weeping that came from somewhere so deep in her that she could not have said where it began, only that it was connected to everything, to the cruelty of the thing she had done, to the bravery of the thing he had done, to the gap between those two things and who she had been and who she wanted to be, and to something else she could not name but that was very large and very warm and hurt precisely because it was so warm. She wept for the rest of that day and well into the night, and she wept the next morning, and on and off through the following days with the particular persistence of a grief that is also a reckoning. A week of it, quiet and private, going about her work in the store and her tasks at home, and carrying it all with her. This sorrow that was also, she gradually understood, the thing that happened to a person when they realized they were in love and were ashamed of how they had treated the person they loved. On the 8th day she stopped weeping, not because she felt better, but because she understood what she had to do, and the understanding organized everything else. She went to the store and she told her father she needed to take the afternoon, and Thomas Dugan looked at her face and said nothing and simply nodded, because Thomas Dugan understood his daughter better than she knew. She drove north again. The Crescent Place, which she had begun in her mind to call the Carver Place, though it had not yet earned the name, was more transformed than the last time she had seen it. The yard had been cleared. The fence along the south side was new and straight. The vegetable garden along the eastern wall was obviously thriving. The house itself looked like a house now, not a wreck in progress, with all its windows glazed and its door hung properly, and a small covered porch added along the front. It was modest and it was sturdy, and it was clearly the work of a man who intended to remain. Henry was in the garden when she arrived, crouching to examine something in the rows, and he stood when he heard the wagon and watched her climb down without moving toward her, giving her the space to come to him or not. She came to him. She walked across the yard and stopped in front of him and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she could see in his face that he was braced for something, uncertain what, and she felt the weight of everything she was carrying, and she said it. "I know about the Palo Duro Canyon," she said. "I know what happened and what you did and what it cost you." He went very still. Something in his face shifted, the composure not cracking but trembling slightly, like a wall in an earthquake, the structure holding but the vibration visible. "Claude Hartley told Nora," she said. "I want you to know I have done nothing but think about it for the past week. I want you to know that what I said in the store." She stopped. She was not going to cry in front of him. She was not going to make this about her emotion. "What I said in the store was wrong when I said it, and it is more wrong now that I know what I know, and I am standing here because I need you to understand that the person who said that is not who I want to be, and I believe that seeing you," she stopped again and swallowed. "Knowing you has made me understand the difference." Henry stood very still for a long moment, looking at her, and the gray eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before, something complicated and careful and moving. "I did not come here for any kind of reward," he said quietly. "I came here to farm. I know that. I did not come to have people know about what happened. I know that too." She held his gaze, "and I will not repeat it to anyone else if that is your preference. But I am telling you that I know, because I cannot stand here and speak to you without you understanding that I understand what I mocked." The words sat between them, honest and awful. He looked away briefly, across the garden, across the fence line, out to the sweep of the plains. When he looked back, his face had changed, the door not open exactly, but the handle turned. "You came out here again," he said. "Yes. 8 miles in the heat. It is not so far." Something crossed his face that was definitely a smile, brief and real. "Miss Dugan," he said. "Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it arrived with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to the syllables. "I appreciate more than I can properly say what it took to come here and say this." "It took very little compared to what you did," she said, and her voice broke on the last word just slightly, and she pressed her lips together. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The crops are coming up well. Would you like to see?" It was the most ordinary thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was also the kindest. She said yes. He walked her through the garden and showed her the corn and the beans and the squash, and explained what he intended for the following year. And as he talked, his voice resumed its natural, unhurried quality, and she walked beside him and listened. And when he paused to crouch and show her something in the soil, she crouched beside him, not caring about her dress, and looked at what he was showing her. And at some point, she became aware that they were very close, and that the air between them was charged with something that was not corn or beans or soil. He showed her the house as well, which she had not expected but which she was glad of, because it told her more about him than months of conversation in the store. It was simple inside, almost austere, but entirely deliberate, with a table and 2 chairs and a good iron stove and a shelf of books, more than 3 now. She saw he had acquired more, and everything precisely where it needed to be. The calico she had sold him was indeed made into curtains, and they were hung without particular artistry but with evident care. And she stood in the kitchen and looked at those curtains and felt something so tender move through her that she had to look away. Before she left, he walked her to the wagon and helped her up, and he held her hand for the moment of that task, and then continued to hold it for 1 moment longer than the task required, and then released it with a deliberateness that suggested it was a conscious act. "I will see you in town," he said. "You will," she said, although she hesitated, then said it. "You might also see me here if you would not object to it." The steady gray eyes looked up at her from the yard. "I would not object to it," he said, and the warmth in his voice was unmistakable, the door fully open at last. She drove home in the gold afternoon light with her heart making noise in her chest and her face doing something she could not control. August became the finest month Adelaide had known in a long time. She came out to the Carver place on Sunday afternoons, which was the proper time for social visits, and which gave both of them the covering of convention, though they were both aware that convention was not the primary motivation. She brought food, because she was a practical woman and a good cook, and because bringing food was an honest acknowledgement of what she had done to him, feeding someone being a form of care that required no words. She brought cornbread and preserves, and once a full chicken pie that she was privately rather proud of, and he fed her coffee, and they sat on the new porch he had built and watched the light change across the plains and talked. They talked about everything. Books. He had been reading Dickens, and she had read her way through the limited selection at the Millhaven lending library, and they had a remarkable amount of common ground and even more satisfying disagreement. Texas, what it was and what it might be, and whether the cattle culture was going to outlast the fence, which was a genuinely contentious topic in Millhaven in 1878. Her mother, who had died 4 years ago of a fever, and whom Adelaide missed with a specific daily ache. His family in Missouri, whom he spoke of with care and some guilt, because leaving had not been simple. The war, the aftermath of the war, the vast and complicated landscape of what the country was trying to become, and how uneven the becoming was. He spoke, on one of those afternoons, about the Buffalo Soldiers, about what it had been like to serve alongside men who were doing their duty in a country that did not fully acknowledge their right to exist as citizens, who fought and died for a flag that had not always been raised for them. He said this without bitterness, but with a kind of grave honesty that she found more affecting than bitterness would have been, because it acknowledged the injustice clearly without pretending it had not existed, and she listened and understood that this, too, had shaped the man sitting beside her, that the experience of serving with men who were brave and capable and systematically undervalued had made him see certain things about the world that could not be unseen. "It changes you," he said. "Watching good men do extraordinary things and then watching the world decide not to notice." "Did they at least have good officers?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Some were there because they believed in the work. Some were there because no one else wanted the posting." A pause. "Claude Hartley was one of the good ones." "He speaks highly of you," she said. "He is a generous man." "He is also an accurate one," she said, and looked at him directly, and this time neither of them looked away. She knew by this point that she loved him. She had known it since the afternoon she had cried in her room, which meant she had known it through the full weight of guilt and grief and self-knowledge, which meant she knew it solidly, the way you know things that you have earned through difficulty. She was not certain what to do with it, because this was 1878 and she was a woman in a small town, and there were rules about these things, most of which were absurd, all of which were real. She was also, she suspected, not the only one who knew something. Henry Carver watched her, not in an intrusive way, not in the way of a man who has decided what he wants regardless of what the woman wants, but in the way of someone who is paying very close attention to something he values. He caught her eye and held it. He remembered things she had said weeks earlier and referenced them in new conversations, which told her he was keeping the thread of what she told him. He noticed when she was tired and adjusted the tone of his conversation accordingly. He noticed when she was sharp and witty and gave her the room to be both without competition. He laughed at her jokes, which she was not accustomed to, because her humor was dry and fast, and most people in Millhaven were approximately 1 second behind it. On a Sunday afternoon in the middle of September, they were sitting on the porch, and the sky was doing extraordinary things, stacking clouds of orange and violet above the western horizon, and she had been talking about something. She could not afterward remember what, and she trailed off in the middle of it because the sky was so remarkable, and Henry was not looking at the sky. He was looking at her, and when she turned and saw him looking, she did not look away, and he did not look away. And the silence lasted long enough to be a whole conversation. "I am not a man who speaks around things," he said. "I know that," she said. "I find myself in an unfamiliar position," he said, "because the thing I am thinking requires me to say it, and I am not entirely sure of the ground." She held very still, the way you hold still when a bird has landed near you and you do not want to frighten it. "The ground is not as uncertain as you think," she said carefully. He looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Adelaide, I think about you more than I think about anything else. I think about your voice and what you say and how you see things. I think about what it would be like to tell you something and have you tell me what you think about it for the rest of my life." He stopped. "That is probably more than you expected." She felt herself smiling in a way that she had no control over, a full and helpless smile that was doing things to her face that she was entirely powerless to moderate. "It is rather direct," she said. "You told me you prefer direct." "I do," she said. "I very much do." She paused, gathering herself, and then said it clearly because he deserved clarity. "I feel the same way. I have for some time. I was afraid of it, and I was less than myself because of that fear, and I am sorry for that. But I feel the same way." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was so open and unguarded that it moved her deeply, because she understood how rarely Henry Carver allowed himself to be unguarded and what it meant that he was allowing it now. "May I call on you properly?" he said. "At your father's house?" "You may," she said, "although I suspect my father has been expecting you." The small, quiet smile again, the one that reached his eyes. "I have already spoken to him," Henry said. She laughed outright at that. A full and genuine laugh that rose into the orange and violet evening, and he watched her laugh, and his face was completely and utterly transformed by something that was plainly joy. And she thought she had never seen anything as beautiful as Henry Carver experiencing joy on his own porch in the autumn light. He called on her properly at the Dugan house the following Friday evening, arriving with his hat in his hand, and a small bunch of wildflowers that he had obviously gathered himself from the prairie, which she found more touching than any florist's arrangement would have been. And Thomas Dugan received him with the warmth of a man who has already made his judgment and is simply glad to have his judgment confirmed. They sat in the parlor and talked, all three of them, and it was easy, the way all of it was easy once the ground was known. He walked her home from church the following Sunday, which in Millhaven was understood to mean something, and the something was understood throughout the town within approximately the same afternoon, because this was Millhaven and information moved with the efficiency of water finding its level. Cecilia March had things to say about it that were somewhat less charitable than they might have been. Martha Boone was surprised but rallied quickly to a kind of retrospective enthusiasm. Nora Wells was simply, entirely, and vocally delighted, in the way that a person is delighted when something they have been hoping for arrives. Adelaide let the town think what it thought, because for once she was not inclined to manage the narrative. She was busy living in it. The autumn was extraordinary. She had spent 23 autumns in Millhaven, and none of them had felt like this one, textured and full and shimmering with the particular quality of a life that is actually happening. She went out to the Carver place nearly every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesday afternoons as well, and they harvested what the test crops had produced, which was better than Henry had expected and better than most people in Millhaven had predicted. She stood in the field with him, and they filled the baskets together and carried them in, and she felt something that was domestic and real and entirely without pretension, which was the thing she had always wanted without having had the words for it. He kissed her for the first time in October, on the porch, in the last of the warm evenings, with the stars coming out above the dark prairie in their astonishing multitudes. It was not a rash or accidental kiss. It was exactly like everything Henry Carver did, deliberate and quiet and entirely complete in itself, and she held onto the front of his coat with both hands and felt the world rearrange itself into an entirely new and superior configuration. He proposed to her in November, in the store of all places, on a Tuesday morning when she was the only person in it, and he came in with a small purpose made evident in his bearing and no list in his hand, which was unusual, and she knew before he spoke what he was going to say. He said it standing at the counter, direct and simple and entirely himself, asking her to marry him with the seriousness of a man who understood what he was asking and the warmth of a man who very much wanted the answer to be yes. She said yes before he had entirely finished the sentence, which was not ladylike and which she did not care about in the slightest, and she came around the counter to him, and he took her face in both his large weathered hands and looked at her for a long moment with an expression of such pure and evident happiness that she felt her eyes fill and blinked hard, because she had sworn to herself she would not cry in front of him except with the good kind of tears. And then she decided that the good kind of tears were acceptable, and let them come. They were married in December, on a clear cold Saturday in the Millhaven Methodist Church, with Reverend Marsh officiating, and the whole town in attendance because this was Millhaven, and the whole town attended everything. Adelaide wore a cream-colored dress that she and Nora had made together over the course of 3 weeks, simple and well-constructed, and she carried the same prairie wildflowers he had brought to her father's house, dried and tied with a green ribbon, because she was who she was. Henry wore a dark coat that fit him properly and stood at the front of the church with Claude Hartley beside him as his witness, and looked at her when she walked down the aisle with an expression that she knew she would see in her memory every day for the rest of her life. Thomas Dugan walked her down the aisle and gave her hand to Henry Carver's and said nothing, because Thomas Dugan's silence was his most eloquent language. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the church hall, and the town ate and drank and danced. And Adelaide danced with her father first and then with Henry, who danced carefully. In the deliberate way he did everything, but steadily and with a grace that surprised her. And she said as much, and he told her he had learned in Missouri as a boy and had not entirely forgotten. And she laughed, and he pulled her a fraction closer than was strictly necessary for the dancing, and she let him. They went home to the Carver place that night, the stars enormous above the dark plains, the cold air sharp with winter, and Henry carried her over the threshold of the little house, managing the step with characteristic steadiness, and set her down inside and looked at her in the lamplight of their own home and said, "Hello, Mrs. Carver," in a voice so quiet and full that she pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his arms come around her, and thought that she had never in her life been so completely exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter at the homestead was different from winter in town, more immediate and more real, with the weight of the cold pressing against the walls and the necessity of the fire, and the intimacy of two people managing a shared life in a small space. She had known, before she came, that she was practical and capable, but she discovered new dimensions of it in those months, learned the rhythms of the homestead the way you learn a new language, by immersion and error and repetition. Henry was a patient teacher and an honest partner, neither condescending nor overly protective, assuming she could do things and being proved right, which was the best possible approach. They read in the evenings, side by side, sharing the lamp, sometimes reading aloud to each other in the particular way that people who love words and love each other find to be one of the greatest pleasures available. He read to her from Dickens, and she read to him from the newspapers, which she received by mail, and which she read with the concentrated attention of a person who intends to understand the world. They argued about politics and land rights and the direction of the country, with the vigor of two people who care about these things and respect each other enough to disagree. And she found that these arguments, which might have been difficult with another man, were with Henry some of the most alive and satisfying conversations she had ever had. Spring came, and with it the full planting season and the transformation of the Carver homestead into something that was genuinely and evidently a working farm. They planted together, the two of them and a hired hand named Billy Webb, who was 17 and thin, and worked with the tremendous enthusiasm of the newly employed. The corn went in and the beans went in, and Henry put in a small kitchen garden along the south wall for Adelaide's herbs and vegetables, which she tended with a proprietary care that amused him, though he expressed this amusement only in the subtle way that was his manner. It was in that spring that Adelaide discovered she was expecting a child, and she told Henry on a morning in April while the light was new and the prairie was green from the spring rains, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. He sat down at the table, which was unusual because Henry was not generally a man who sat down unexpectedly, and he looked at her with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, joy, something vulnerable and wondering. And then he said with perfect sincerity, "I am very glad." She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other in the bright morning kitchen of their house and were glad together. The pregnancy went well, as these things sometimes do and sometimes do not, and Adelaide was stronger through it than most people expected, and she did not particularly care what most people expected. She continued to drive in to help at her father's store twice a week, until the summer made the drive uncomfortable, and she continued to manage the homestead with the same practical efficiency, adjusting as necessary, which was the most she had ever been asked to do by any circumstance. Thomas Dugan came out to the homestead regularly through the summer, driving himself and arriving with provisions and opinions about the crops, and saying nothing about the pregnancy except to ask once whether she was well. And when she said she was entirely well, he accepted this and said nothing further, which was exactly the right response. Henry was, she searched for the right word and settled on attentive, but meant something larger. He was present in a way that went beyond practical help, though he was practically helpful in every way he could be. He noticed when she was tired before she admitted it. He adjusted the work of the homestead without discussion, taking on the heavier labor without making a point of it, because he understood that making a point of it would diminish her. He talked to her in the evenings about the child with a seriousness that she found deeply affecting, as though the child were already a person whose arrival he was preparing himself to properly receive. The baby was born in November, a boy, delivered by the town midwife, Martha Greenfield, who had been delivering Millhaven's children for 20 years and who managed everything with brisk competence. Henry was in the next room, which was where men were supposed to be in 1879, and Adelaide could feel his presence through the wall the way you feel a fire through a wall, the warmth of it. When it was done and Martha Greenfield carried the baby to him, Adelaide heard the silence and then heard Henry's voice, very low, saying something she could not make out, and the quality of that voice told her everything. He came in and sat beside her on the bed and held the baby, who was small and dark-haired and loudly opinionated, and looked at him with an expression that Adelaide knew she would hold in her memory along with the expression at the church, another one of those moments that are in themselves sufficient. "What do we call him?" she asked. "I thought," he stopped. "Only if you agree. I thought we might call him Thomas." She looked at him. He was looking at the baby, but she could see the side of his face, the earnest and careful expression of a man making an offering, Thomas, for her father. She felt her throat tighten in that specific and pleasant way. "Yes," she said, "Thomas Henry Carver." Henry looked at her then, and the warmth in his face was something she held onto like a handhold on a steep slope. Thomas Dugan Sr. came out on a Sunday morning and held his grandson for a long time without speaking, which was how Thomas Dugan expressed the things that exceeded his capacity for language. Adelaide watched him and watched Henry watching him, and thought that her life, the life she was living in this place she had not expected, on this land that had seemed unremarkable until she had learned to see it the way Henry saw it, was so much more than what she had imagined standing behind her father's counter cataloging the world and thinking she already understood it. Little Thomas grew, in the way that babies do, with the rapid and astonishing transformation of the very young. He grew into a toddler who was determined and loud, and who followed his father around the homestead with the focused devotion of someone who has identified his primary authority on all subjects. Henry was with him in the way he was with everything, patient and honest and present, crouching to Thomas's level to show him things in the soil or the grass, explaining the names of plants and birds with the same seriousness he brought to adult conversation. Adelaide watched them in the evenings and felt something so large she had no word for it. Nora Wells married a good man from the neighboring county in 1880, a farmer named David Lester, and Adelaide stood beside her at the altar in the same church where she had stood 2 years before and felt the joy of it, one of the particular pleasures of a happy life being the happiness of people you love. They celebrated the wedding with the whole town, and Adelaide danced with Henry until her feet ached, and she did not care. Thomas Dugan's health began to soften in that same year, the gradual slowing of a man in his late 50s who had worked hard his whole life and whose body was beginning to present its accounting. He had a cough that came and went and a fatigue that surprised him because he was not accustomed to being tired. Adelaide drove into the store twice a week and helped him, and Henry came in on Saturdays, and between them they ensured that the store continued to run with the efficiency Thomas had built into it over 20 years. Thomas was grateful in the way he was grateful for everything, without excessive expression, simply continuing to do what he could and accepting what was given. In the spring of 1881, Adelaide told Henry there would be another baby, and he received this information standing in the garden in the early morning with Thomas Jr. at his feet pulling up small handfuls of grass and handing them to him as though they were gifts, which he was accepting with complete gravity. He looked at her, and a slow smile moved across his face, unhurried as everything else about him. And he said, "Good," simply, and she laughed at the simplicity of it. The second baby was a girl, born in November of 1881 in the same room as her brother, with the same midwife and the same awareness of Henry's presence through the wall. They named her Alina, for Henry's mother, and she was fair where Thomas was dark and quieter though no less determined, and Henry held her with the same wondering expression, and Adelaide thought she would never stop being moved by the sight of him holding their children. By 1882, the homestead had become something that people in Millhaven discussed as an example of what the land could do in the hands of a patient and capable farmer. The corn yields were consistently good. The kitchen garden produced with abundance. Henry had added a small orchard of hardy fruit trees along the eastern fence line that would take years to fully produce, but that he had planted with his characteristic long view, thinking forward in time the way he thought about most things. There was a proper barn now, a well that never went dry, a second room added to the house, and the south porch expanded to accommodate the evenings. Claude Hartley came for supper in the summer of 1882, and the four of them, he and his wife Mary, sat on the porch after the meal while the children slept inside and talked until late. And at some point the conversation came around to the past, as it sometimes did when Claude and Henry were together, and Claude told a story from the campaign that made Adelaide see again what she now knew. That the easy and steady man beside her contained within him a history of tested courage that had left its mark on him in the only visible way it had, the limp, the daily testimony to the moment he had turned his horse around. She was not watching the story. She was watching Henry's face as Claude told it, the quiet with which he received the retelling, the absence of pride and the absence of false modesty, the simple acceptance of what had happened as having happened as part of the account of a life, neither its definition nor its irrelevance. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She said nothing because she had long since learned that some things communicated themselves fully without language, and what she was communicating was, "I know, I see. I am so sorry for what I did not see at first. And I love you, and the thing you carry in your leg is something I carry in my heart as an understanding of what a person can be." His hand covered hers on his arm, and his thumb moved once lightly across her knuckles, and they returned their attention to Claude's story. And the summer night settled over the homestead with its stars and its warm air and its profound and ordinary peace. Adelaide stood at the well one morning in August of 1882, pulling up the bucket, and she thought about the woman she had been in the spring of 1878, quick to judge, habituated to cataloging, protected by the small cruelties of superiority. And she thought about the woman she was now, and the distance between them was not a comfortable distance, but it was a necessary one, and what had bridged it was love and shame in equal measure, which she thought was probably how most important changes happened in a person. She thought about the laugh, the one that had risen in her in the first moment before she knew anything about him. She thought about it without flinching now, which was progress, because for a long time she could not think about it without something in her wanting to collapse with the weight of it. She had said something else cruel later, and she had apologized for that too, but it was the first moment, the laugh that she had shared with Nora before she had said a single word to him, that lived with her as the sharpest indicator of who she had been and did not intend to remain. She had become someone else. Not a different person, because she believed in the continuity of the self, but a person who had been given information about him, about herself, and had chosen to change in response to it. The choosing was the thing. The choosing was what made it matter. Thomas Dugan's cough worsened in the winter of 1882, and the doctor in Millhaven, a careful young man named Pritchard who had come from a medical school in St. Louis, told Adelaide that her father's lungs were compromised, that it was not immediately dangerous but that it would require management and rest. Thomas Dugan's response to this diagnosis was to be briefly irritated, and then to become quietly pragmatic about it, which was entirely consistent with his character. He accepted that the store required more assistance, and Henry and Adelaide restructured their week to provide it, Henry taking over the store on weekdays and Adelaide on weekends, which required some adjustment to the rhythms of the homestead, but which was managed because they were people who managed things. Henry behind the counter of the general store was, she thought, one of the more quietly extraordinary things she had ever witnessed. He was different there than she had expected, not uncomfortable, as she might have predicted, but simply himself, and himself turned out to be very good at listening to what people needed and providing it without superfluous conversation, which it turned out was exactly what most customers wanted most of the time. The people of Millhaven, after some initial adjustment, decided they liked him, which they had been edging toward for years in any case, and the store continued to do good business. Thomas Dugan, freed from some of his daily responsibilities, rallied somewhat, as people sometimes do when the pressure is lifted, and spent more time at the homestead, more time with Thomas Jr. and little Eleanor, more time sitting in the sun on the south porch talking with Henry about everything under it. Adelaide watched them sometimes from the kitchen window, her father and her husband, two men of completely different shapes who had found in each other the particular ease of mutual respect, and she thought that her father was happy, which was a thing she had worried about more than she had admitted, and was now relieved of worrying. In the spring of 1883, Adelaide discovered there was a third child coming, and she told Henry in the kitchen on a morning when Thomas Jr. was chasing Eleanor around the yard with a stick horse, and neither of them was managing to be quiet about it. And Henry stood at the window watching his children and turned to look at her when she spoke, and the expression on his face was everything she had come to know it would be. The quiet, comprehensive, complete happiness of a man who is living the life he chose and knowing it. The third child was a boy they named James, for no one in particular and for everyone in general, a cheerful baby who arrived with a full complement of opinions and a remarkable volume for his size. The house was full now in the way that small houses become full, with boots at the door and voices in every room and the accumulated clutter of children growing and needing and discovering. And Adelaide stood in the middle of it sometimes, and felt a kind of wondering gratitude that sat at the base of her chest like a warm stone. Little Thomas was 4 by now, old enough to help in the garden with the focused intensity of a child who has decided a thing is important, which was so completely his father that Adelaide sometimes had to look away. Eleanor was 2, and had her father's gray eyes and her mother's particular way of looking at the world, as though she intended to file her own opinions about it. James was new and needed everything and got it, because that is what new things get in a home where there is love to spare. Claude Hartley's wife Mary organized a quilting circle in the fall of 1883 that met at various homes around the district, and when it came around to the Carver homestead, Adelaide spent a week preparing for it with a thoroughness that Henry observed with affectionate patience, pointing out gently that she had hosted large gatherings many times, and that this was a circle of 8 women, not a territorial assembly. She agreed with him entirely and then finished preparing with the same thoroughness, because she was who she was and he knew it and loved it. The quilting circle was a success. The women came and sat and stitched and talked, and Nora was there, and Mary Hartley, and several others she had known for years, and they talked about the things that women talked about in that place and time, the children and the land and the practical difficulties of daily life, and the occasional larger questions about what the country was and what it ought to be. Adelaide had always been comfortable in these conversations, had always been one of the sharper voices in them, but she was different now in ways she felt even when she could not name them, more patient with the views that differed from her own, more willing to be uncertain, more interested in understanding than in being right. She thought sometimes about what Henry had said about the soldiers he had served alongside, the men who had done extraordinary things in a country that was still deciding whether to acknowledge them. She had written a letter, at some point in the spring of 1882, to the Millhaven weekly paper, a careful and honest letter about the service of the Buffalo soldiers in the Red River campaign, citing what she knew from Claude Hartley's testimony and from the published accounts she had read. She had signed it with her own name. The paper had printed it, though with some editorial hedging, and the town had discussed it in the particular way of Millhaven, half of it strongly in favor and half of it strongly opposed, and the whole of it conducted with the volume of people who care about something. Henry had read the letter in the paper and looked at her across the breakfast table and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You did not ask me before you wrote it." "I knew what you would say," she said. "You would say it was not necessary." "It was not necessary," he said. "It was right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then the smile came, the quiet real one that still, after years, did the same thing to her breath, and he said, "Yes, it was right." By 1885, the Carver homestead was one of the most productive farms in the region surrounding Millhaven, and this was a fact that Henry accepted with the same equanimity with which he accepted most facts, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of work done and a plan carried out. The orchard had begun to produce, which was a thing he had known would take years and had planted anyway. And when the first real yield of apples came off the trees that autumn, he stood among them with Thomas Jr., who was 7 now and serious and wonderful, and Adelaide watched them from the fence, the tall man and the small boy. The boy's face turned up to receive some piece of information his father was offering about the trees and the soil and the time it took for things to become what they were meant to be. She thought about time in those moments, about the time it had taken her to understand Henry Carver, about the time it had taken her to understand herself, about the apology in the yard, which she had given in August of 1878, and which had in some ways been the beginning of everything, not because it had fixed things, but because it had cleared the ground for something to grow on it. She thought about the first day, and the laugh, and the expression on his face in the doorway. She thought about these things not with the crushing weight she had once felt, but with a clear-eyed acknowledgment that was the only honest response to them. They had happened. She had been that person, and she had chosen to become someone different, and the becoming had given her everything she had. Thomas Dugan was doing well enough, in the generous way that his condition allowed. He had settled into a quieter life, coming to the homestead every other Sunday for dinner, spending his weekday mornings in the store at a reduced capacity, spending his afternoons in his own house with his pipe and his newspapers, and the occasional visit from whomever in Millhaven felt like sitting with him, which turned out to be quite a few people, because Thomas Dugan was the kind of man people sought out when they needed someone who would listen without the requirement of response. He came to dinner on an October Sunday in 1885 and sat with all 3 of his grandchildren at the table, and had the particular expression of a man who is aware he is in the middle of something good and knows it. And after dinner, while the children were rampaging around the yard with a freedom that would have horrified Sunday school teachers, he sat with Adelaide on the porch and said, with no particular preamble, "You chose well." She looked at her father. He was looking out at the yard, where Henry was refereeing some dispute between Thomas and a leaner with the patient seriousness he brought to all things. "I know," she said. "Better than you knew you were choosing," her father said. "Considerably better," she agreed. He nodded, as though that settled something, and they sat in the October sun and watched Henry walk back, toward the porch with James on his shoulders and Thomas and a leaner running ahead of him. And all of it was so ordinary and so complete and so entirely sufficient that Adelaide felt that specific and wordless gratitude wash through her again. The warm stone at the base of her chest, permanent now, a fixture of who she was. Henry set James down on the porch steps and looked at her, and then at her father and then back at her. And his gray eyes were warm and steady and entirely themselves. And she thought that she had been looking at those eyes for 7 years now and had never found the bottom of them, and that she intended to keep looking for the rest of her life, and that this was the best possible intention she had ever formed. That evening, after her father had driven home and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of settled peace, she and Henry sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the lamp between them, the way they had sat 1,000 evenings, and she said to him, in the quiet way of things that do not require announcement, "I love you. I want you to know that I understand what that means. I have understood it better every year." He looked at her across the lamp. His face was the face she knew best in the world, the square jaw and the gray eyes, and the plain handsomeness that had stopped being plain to her approximately the moment she had actually seen it. "I know," he said. "I love you too," simple as he was, direct as he always was. And then, after a moment, in the voice that was unhurried and low and that she would hear in her sleep and recognize in her memory when she was very old, he said, "It was the practical information that did it, if you want to know. You told me about the eastern portion of the land. Nobody else had thought to mention it." She laughed, and the laugh was not sharp and not cruel and not anything except full, warm and full, the laughter of a woman who is happy in the precise place and time she inhabits, sitting in her own kitchen with the man she loves, their children sleeping in the next room, the prairie dark and enormous outside the windows and entirely friendly in its darkness. "The corn proved you right," he said. "The corn usually does prove me right," she said. "On most things," he agreed, and the smile was there, the quiet, real one, permanent now, hers. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand palm up and held hers, and they sat together in the lamplight, while the wind moved through the prairie grass outside, and the stars did their vast and silent business overhead. And the life they had built between them, through misjudgment and shame and courage and honesty, and the slow and ordinary miracle of two people choosing each other every day, continued to be exactly what it was. Sufficient, warm, complete, and moving always forward into whatever the next day would bring, which they would meet together, as they had met everything, steadily and without apology. Thomas Jr. learned to read that winter and read everything he could find, including the spines of his father's books, and Henry began reading to him in the evenings the same way he had read aloud to Adelaide in those first quiet years. And Adelaide sat in the lamplight and listened to her husband's voice and her son's questions, and thought that some things could not have been predicted and should not have been, that some things you had to arrive at by an imperfect route to arrive at properly. Elinor developed a particular passion for the garden and could identify every plant in her mother's kitchen garden by name before she was 5, which Adelaide found both satisfying and entirely characteristic. James remained cheerful and loud, and was beloved by everyone in the household for the unreserved fullness of his affection, which he distributed without prejudice. The homestead held them all and continued to grow, the orchard deepening, the fields expanding by 1 additional acre in the spring of 1886, the barn extended to accommodate 2 more animals. Henry walked the land every morning, every day, in every season, his steady, uneven stride crossing the fields and the fence lines with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything. And Adelaide sometimes watched him from the window and thought about the leg that was not whole and the choice that had made it that way. And she held it in her mind not with sorrow, but with a clear and enduring respect that was one of the foundational stones of what she knew about him and what she knew about love. The limp never left him. It would not leave him. It was woven into the fabric of how he moved through the world, as permanent as his gray eyes and his quiet manner, and his habit of saying the direct and necessary thing. The children understood, as children understand the textures of their parents, that this was simply how their father walked, and Thomas Jr. once asked about it, and Henry told him the truth in simple terms, a simple and honest answer about a choice that had been made and a cost that had been paid. And Thomas Jr. was quiet for a long time afterward, and then said, with 7-year-old seriousness, that he thought his father was very brave. And Henry put his hand on the boy's head and said that anyone would have done the same, which Adelaide, listening from the kitchen. Knew was not true but understood was the kind of thing that a certain kind of person always says. The years settled around them in the way of good years, each one different and each one adding to the whole. Millhaven grew, as small towns in Texas were growing in those years. New buildings and new people and new controversies and new celebrations. The ordinary forward motion of a community deciding what it is. Adelaide continued her involvement in all of it, on the town council for a brief period, involved in the expansion of the school, part of the group that advocated successfully for a proper doctor's office, when Dr. Pritchard made clear he needed a proper space, or he would take his practice to a larger town. Henry's farm was cited in a regional agricultural publication in 1887 as an example of successful dryland farming technique, and a man came from the publication to interview him, and Adelaide stood in the kitchen making coffee and listening to Henry describe his approach to soil management with the same plain accuracy he brought to everything, and she thought that she was proud of him in a way that was very simple and very large. Thomas Dugan passed away in the winter of 1888, peacefully in his own house, with Adelaide beside him and the evening quiet around them. It was not unexpected, and it was not prolonged, and he had lived his years fully and without apology, which was how he had always done things. Adelaide sat with him for a long time after, and then she drove home through the winter dark to the homestead, and Henry came to the door when he heard the wagon, and she walked into his arms, and he held her for a long time without speaking, which was exactly right. They buried Thomas Dugan beside his wife, Adelaide's mother, in the Millhaven churchyard, with a good part of the town in attendance, because Thomas Dugan had been present in Millhaven for 30 years, and his absence was felt the way all genuine presences are felt when they become absences, as a specific shape in the air. Henry carried her grief with her the way he carried all difficult things, steadily and without making it heavier, which was the particular grace of someone who understood that grief is not a problem to be solved but a weight to be shared. She was grateful for him in this with a gratitude that went beyond words, and she told him so one evening several months later, and he said, "I know," in the simple way that meant he did, in fact, know. The store was sold in 1889 to a young couple from East Texas who wanted to stay in Millhaven, and the money went toward the homestead and toward a modest fund that Adelaide managed with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. It was strange to let the store go, strange to walk past it and see someone else's arrangements in the window, but it was the right decision and she knew it, and she folded it into her understanding of how things change and move and become other things. In the summer of 1890, on an evening when the light was very good and the prairie smelled of grass and the orchard was full of green fruit not yet ripe, Adelaide walked out to where Henry was fixing a section of fence along the eastern edge of the property, and she stood nearby and watched him work for a while, the familiar deliberate movements, the steadiness of him against the open sky, and she thought about all of it. The full account of the 12 years since a man with a limp had walked into her father's store, and she had exchanged a glance with Nora Wells, and she thought about who she had been and who she was and about the distance between those two people, which was not empty distance, but was filled entirely with everything that had happened. He became aware of her watching and turned, and he looked at her across the grass with the same gray eyes that had looked at her across a counter in a dusty store in the spring of 1878, and she walked toward him, and he met her halfway across the field the way they had always been meeting each other, midway, honestly, with nothing withheld. She took his hand, his large, steady hand, and held it, and they stood together in the evening light of the Carver homestead that had been the Crescent parcel that had been 8 miles of rough country with Caliche in the western half, and she looked up at him and said, "I am very glad you walked into the store." He looked at her for a moment. "You laughed," he said, and there was nothing in it except the fact, stated plainly, because they could speak plainly to each other about all things. "I know," she said. And then I wept for a week. You told me, he said. I will probably tell you again. Probably, he agreed. And the small, quiet smile was there and would always be there, as permanent and real, and hers as anything she had ever known. The children came running across the field toward them. Thomas in the lead because he was always in the lead, Alina close behind with her determined stride, James tumbling somewhere in the rear with his cheerful lack of urgency. And Henry released her hand to catch Thomas as he arrived at a full sprint, swinging him up with a grunt, and the boys' delighted yell going up into the evening air. And Adelaide watched them and felt the warm stone in her chest glow with everything it held. And she knew that this specific ordinary, extraordinary life, this man, this land, these children, this evening, the full and irreplaceable weight of it all was the best thing she had ever been given. And she intended to hold onto it with both hands, every day, for as long as she was given. The years went forward as they do, and the Carver homestead endured, and the family within it grew and changed and remained, through all of it, exactly what it was. A family built on honesty and courage and the willingness to look at oneself clearly and choose, every day, to be something better than what you had been before. And on ordinary evenings, when the light came in long and gold through the windows, and the children were settled and the work was done, Adelaide Dugan Carver sat across the table from Henry Carver, and saw in his face everything she had ever needed to know about what a person could be. And she was grateful for it with the full and lasting gratitude of a woman who had once been small enough to mock it and had been made large enough, by love and by sorrow and by the long work of becoming, to deserve it.